Okay, everyone. Hello. Let me get our American Revolution presentation up going here. Whoops. Period two. It's good to have you here. Let's try this out again. We're going to talk about the American Revolution. And what I want us to think about is the connection it has to the Enlightenment. All right, those ideas that we just talked about, the big ideas that we just talked about, here we go. Okay, so before we can even talk about the American Revolution, we have to talk about one other war that occurred. And this was the French and Indian War. And it wasn't the French versus Native Americans, it was like the French with their Native American allies, with their Native American friends, were fighting the British in North America. And what this was from 1754 to 1763 was essentially a battle between the British and French empires, who were both on the march around the world trying to conquer territory and amass power. And the problem was what was happening in North America was that the British colonies, the 13 colonies, were pushing sort of further west into more of the American continent. And the further west they pushed, the more conflict there was between Native American people and the colonists, the British colonists in America. And so the Native Americans, who were like, what are you all doing here? And this is our land, right? Makes sense. Began to engage in more aggressive attacks in order to protect themselves and to protect their land. And so colonists were being hurt, colonists were being killed, colonists were being threatened. And the French saw this as an opportunity and said, hey, Native Americans, if we join together, we will make sure that your land is protected. And while that was happening, the British ended up building a series of forts, which were these sort of like military camps to protect colonists from these Native American attacks. Okay, now here's the deal. War costs a lot of money. And Britain spent a great deal of money, shipping their soldiers across the Atlantic to go and protect the colonists in the American colonies. And so, and of course, it costs a lot of money to like clothe the soldiers and to feed the soldiers and to provide soldiers with weapons, right? There's all sorts of costs here. And the British Parliament was paying, right? The British people were paying in order to protect the colonists in the Americas. And so this is where the British government gets into trouble with the American colonists, with the colonists living in the Americas. And so after years of really not paying that close attention to the American colonies, the British government was like, you all need to pay. We protected you, we helped you, and you have not paid your fair share for the cost of all of that. And actually, people living in England, in Great Britain, were really cranky about having to pay for this war to protect the colonists an ocean away. And so the Parliament and King George, that's him right there, were like, okay, you guys got to pay up. It's time. You need to help out. And so they created a series of taxes. And they created a series of laws to sort of get the colonies to pay their fair share and come back under British control. And the first one was the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act is, in fact, what's called a tariff. Tarriff. Tariff. And what this meant was that the colonists living in America had to pay an extra tax on sugar and other things coming from other countries. Right? So if they wanted to buy sugar from the West Indies, from the Dutch, then they had to pay an extra tax. So like British sugar was $10 a pound. I'm just making stuff up. And then Dutch sugar would be, $15 a pound. And what is the purpose of this? The American government does this today, right? Japanese cars versus American cars, right? Subarus versus Ford. And what the American government says is, that's fine, Japan, you can sell your cars in America, but we're going to make them a little bit more expensive. That way, when people go car shopping, when Americans living in this country go shopping, they look at a Subaru and they say, yo, this car is $30,000 compared to this Ford, that's $20,000. And most people are like, I'm going to go with the just as reliable and cheaper option. I'm going to go with the Ford. So what is the government doing here? The government is then using taxes to influence people's behavior, right? To push people to buying the cheaper product. And in this case, in colonial America, it was sugar, right? So that the American colonists were buying more British sugar to benefit British companies, right? And in addition, the British government was collecting the tax on it. Remember, you can stop and pause this whenever you need to in order to write stuff down. You do not have to run through this recorded lecture straight through. Okay, then there was the Stamp Act. And the Parliament put this tax on paper goods. So things like playing cards, things like paper to write letters on, things like newspapers, right? And now this was a big problem because this affected people's entertainment, colonial entertainment, right? There were no PlayStations, there was no YouTube, there was no TikTok in colonial America, right? What people had to entertain themselves were things like card games, were things like writing and receiving letters, newspapers, right? This is how people got their information. And so paper could not be sold unless it had this stamp on it, right? That in order, or not this stamp, but in order for a piece of paper or cards to be sold, it had to have a stamp on top of here. I don't know why they picked the skull and crossbones. It's all very interesting to me. Okay, so now the British are taxing forms of entertainment, which made people cranky. Now, it made people, both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act made people so cranky that the colonists began to complain. Meh, what are you doing? Meh. And Great Britain said to the colonists, what are you even complaining about? We are your boss and we make the rules and you have to follow the rules, right? And now here's the thing that's interesting. And it's sort of like when if you decide to go to college and leave Los Angeles and leave your family's house, and especially after that, well, it might happen to some extent during all 4 years, but especially when you come back from that first year, of living by yourself and you move back in with your family and your family is like, you have to be home by midnight. And you're like, excuse me, I was just the boss of myself for a year. I made the choices. I made the decisions. And now you're telling me I have a curfew. So it's the very same idea here, right? For almost 200 years, as long as Britain was making money off of the colonies, they did not care. The second that the colonies began being expensive for the British is when they began to care. All right, here's another set of laws, right? Taxes that upset people. Taxes were placed on glass and lead, paints, paper, and tea. I don't know if you know this about British people, but they really love their tea. It's their favorite drink. And actually, I'm drinking mint tea right now. And these two gentlemen here are on the left, Paul Revere, and on the right is Samuel Adams. Sam Adams. And these two guys were were part of a group of people in Boston who were interested in making trouble, who were interested in being patriots, who believed that the American colonies should break away from Great Britain. And so these two guys were part of, I think they were called the Sons of Liberty, and they did what they could. Paul Revere was an artist, so he drew things for newspapers. Sam Adams was a writer. He was a lawyer. And so he did a lot of essay writing and article writing and speeches, right? So these two guys, in their own way, were working to get people angry at the British. And I don't know, have you heard about the Boston Massacre? I want you to think about this. When you hear the word massacre, how many people is that? Is a massacre 20 people? Is it 100 people? Is it more than that? Because Paul Revere and Sam Adams, really sort of made what happened was actually, it was a bunch of drunk guys, drunk colonists, winter's night, were at a pub talking trash about the British, cranky about the British, getting themselves all sort of hyped up about the British. And they walked outside to the Boston Commons, right? They were all drunk. They were on their way home. They'd been, getting each other angry. And they saw a group of British soldiers on the Commons and began throwing like snowballs. Because, that's what drunk people do. They do stupid things like throw snowballs at soldiers. And then it's unclear whether maybe like it escalated to rock throwing. And then it's unclear also, but a British soldier, we don't know who, ended up starting to shoot at these drunk and angry colonists. And then once that happened, other soldiers began shooting. And in the end, 5 people were killed and 6 people were wounded. Now, is that a tragedy? Yes, it's a tragedy. Is that a massacre? Sam Adams and Paul Revere really made it seem like, a tremendous act of violence against the colonists. And they really, think about them as like the sort of like the TMZ of the day. Okay. So that's how we get the Boston Massacre. Also, you should know that the first person to die in the Boston Massacre was, of course, a free black man, because that's how horror movies work. Okay. So then there was the Tea Act. And if you remember the Boston Tea Party, learning about that, where a bunch of these white guys decided to get dressed up in red face, right, to like make themselves, pretend to be Native Americans. They were, of course, silly looking. And what happened was in the Tea Party was that these people, this group, angry group, went on board British ship and ended up dumping like 10,000 pounds of tea into the ocean in Boston Harbor. And that is a lot of tea, and tea costs money. And so, the British Parliament was like, guys, actually, until you pay us for all the tea that you threw into the ocean, you do not get trade. Right? Nothing will come in, nothing will come out of Boston. You will not be able to make money. You will not be able to get products. The Boston Harbor is now closed until you pay us. Right. And then they began doing things like making sure that if a British soldier was accused of a crime in America against a colonist, then he was actually shipped back to Britain to be tried in a British court. Right. Also, the colonists were required to feed and house British troops. Right. So they would be like, hi, everybody. It looks like you're having a lovely dinner. These two gentlemen will be staying with you. It is your duty and obligation to feed and house them. And then, of course, the last straw in the intolerable acts was that the colonists basically lost the right to govern themselves, right? The British Parliament said, no, Massachusetts, you have been bad, bad people, and now you don't get to be in charge anymore. Now, it's something that's interesting when we think about the word revolution is I want you to consider, how many people have to be into the revolution for there to be a revolution, right? And at the start of all of this, at the very sort of beginning of this revolutionary moment in America, only about 33% of the colonials were loyalists. These were the people who were like, we love the king, we love Parliament, we are British. 33%, another 33% were patriots, people who were like, you better join or die. We've got to get ourselves together. We have to declare independence. We deserve to be free. We deserve to be our own country. And then the other 33% of people were like, we don't care. We don't care who's in charge. We need to pay the rent and feed our children. So we don't care. And so if we take a look at these numbers, right? A third of the people were into the king. A third of the people didn't care. So 2/3 of people living in the American colonies were like, we don't care or want a revolution. And only 1/3 of the people living in the colonies were like, let's get rid of the king. So this is not good. This is not a good place to be for a revolution. You need more people than just 30% of the people to say that they want a revolution. And so what happened? So here is what folks talked about in our chat, right? The first little battle between the British and a colonial militia, which is a group of, they're not sort of soldiers in an army, but they are people with weapons who are working together, right? That is what a militia is. End up having sort of this little skirmish at Lexington and Concord and Mass. I actually have been there to the bridge where it happened. It's a very beautiful place. Okay. And what's interesting here is that after hundreds of years of fighting with Native Americans, colonial soldiers or fighters, we'll call them, had really picked up on some interesting new tactics, right? Guerrilla style fighting. Whereas the British, as we see in this picture, were sort of like in lines, in red, shooting together, right? The colonials were like hiding behind trees and underneath fences and in barns. And they engaged in what's called like a guerrilla style of fighting. And the British were like, this is not fair. You don't get to do this. Like, this is not how war is fought, blah, 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 blah. Right. So they were actually genuinely upset that they felt like the colonials were fighting unfairly, which is like, why are there rules to war? That doesn't make any sense. Okay. Now, the last few things that happened before the American Revolution really, really began was that the colonials ended up making an army and putting George Washington, I'm very cranky that this is not a capitalized G, as its general. And they also tried to say to the king, look, if you do these 5-10 things, we will stop this, right? We want to try for peace. And King George is pretty much like, piss off. It's all or nothing. You either listen to me and listen to my rules, or we can fight. And then third, which is a really interesting thing, is, well, actually, there's going to be four things. Okay, so then there's Thomas Paine, who was actually a British man who was traveling and living in the American colonies, wrote a little booklet called Common Sense. And in this, he basically used Enlightenment ideas to argue for American independence. He's like, why is this small island country across the ocean controlling America? What about natural rights? What about freedom and liberty? What about a freely elected government? Right? So this is all stuff from the Enlightenment, and Thomas Paine was writing about it. And then, in addition, looking at okay, wait. So first, so you should know, Common Sense was like a blockbuster. It was really popular. It spread along the colonies like fire. Everybody was reading about it and talking about it. Sort of like everybody was watching and talking about. I don't even know what's the latest TV show everybody's watching and talking about. The Selena. Everybody's really into that right now, right? The TV show on Netflix. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence is actually really interesting, and what I need to show you actually is I want to show you the Declaration of Independence itself, because not the Declaration of Sentiments. Nope, I just want the real thing, guys. Just give me the real thing. There we go. That's what I want. Okay, let me make this thing bigger for us. All right, so when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, blah, 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 the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Seems like Mr. Jefferson has stolen some of the words from Mr. John Locke, right? Our Enlightenment philosopher. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from, oh my God, look at this, consent of the governed. Okay, so there's all this Enlightenment stuff in this first paragraph. And then take a look at this, class. He has refused his assent to laws. He has forbidden his governors. He has refused to pass. He has called together. He has dissolved. He has refused. He has endeavored. He has obstructed. He has made. He has erected. He has kept. He has affected. He has combined. He has abdicated. He has plundered. Right? He has constrained. He has excited. Who is this he that we're talking about? Who is Thomas Jefferson complaining about? This guy, King George. So the Declaration of Independence is actually just a list of complaints. Look at all these things that the king has done to us, right? He is wrong. He is wrong, wrong, wrong. And who read this? Well, of course the British read this. Of course the British read this. But you know who else read this? American colonists, right? And this served as a piece of propaganda to persuade people to be for the revolution. Jefferson was smart. Jefferson knew what he was doing. Also, you should know that not all these people were ever in the room at the same time. Just FYI. That's like 18th century Photoshop. So Jefferson, right, stirs up people where enough folks are like, let's go, let's do it, let's make this happen, right? Between Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson, between the king rejecting all sorts of efforts, the war was then on. And the American army, called the Continental Army, was not ready for this. I mean, the British Army was the most powerful army in the world, and they were professional soldiers. They had resources. I mean, it was just a really unfair fight. And And then France stepped in to help the colonists, right? France stepped in and said, we're going to assist you. We hate the British. And because you are the enemy of our enemy, we are now your friend. And so 90% of the gunpowder used by American colonials came from the French. Now, of course, war is hell. And I don't know if folks knew this, but the Revolutionary War was 8 years long. When I realized that, I think when I first started teaching US history, I did not realize that it was 8 years long. It was long, y'all. And 25,000 soldiers died. A bunch of people were injured. I need you to know, just for fun, that it's important for us to know that women were a part of the war effort, that Black folks, both enslaved and free Black folks, were a part of the war effort, right? They were promised freedom by both the British and by the Americans, right? If you fight for us and with us, we will give you freedom. That did not happen. Okay. And then, of course, we had this very famous Washington crossing the Delaware River in the middle of winter. Cute stuff. Okay. I don't really care about the war. I'll be honest with you. I'm not a military historian. Is there a Call of Duty that's American Revolution? I think there is, isn't there? Anyway, the revolution ends. Right? The Americans are finally able to push out the British. They surrender at Yorktown. And then there's a treaty that's created in Paris. And it is signed between America, the new United States, and Great Britain. So now it's like, what's next? What do we do? Yay, we won. Yay, go us. And now people are like, how do we run a country? How do we make democracy happen? And if you take US history with me, you will learn all about the next stage. But for us, what's really important to remember is, what was this revolution about? Was this about, you know, was this about freedom? Was this about equality? Was this about independence? What was the goal of this revolution? Because what you should know is that most people's lives did not change. Most people living in the American colonies, their lives did not change at all by the end of the revolution. It didn't matter whether the British were in charge or whether Americans were in charge for the majority of people living in the American colonies. Right? So does that count as a revolution? These are all good questions. Okay. So we are going to wrap this up. And hang on one second. And